London, December 1952. A city of 9 million people. A city that had survived the Blitz, survived centuries of war and fire and flood. A city that believed it had seen the worst the world could throw at it. It had not. What was coming left no craters. It made no sound. It carried no army. It was something far more patient than a bomb, far more quiet than a bullet. It was the air itself. And when it finally arrived, most people never even knew it was killing them. This is the story of 5 days that changed the world. It began, as so many disasters do, with something ordinary. A cold front settled over the Thames Valley in early December. Temperatures dropped. People did what Londoners had done for centuries. They lit their fires. Coal fires in millions of homes, in hundreds of factories and power stations that ran day and night along the river. The smoke rose, as it always had, but this time, something was different. The air did not move. A weather phenomenon called a temperature inversion had locked a layer of warm air above the city like a lid on a pot. Normally, smoke and pollution rise and disperse. But with nowhere to go, the emissions from 4 million coal fires began to pool. They mixed with the fog that naturally forms over the Thames in winter. They combined with sulfur dioxide from factory chimneys and exhaust from diesel buses. And they created something London had never truly faced before. Something that would later be given a single, chilling word: smog. By the morning of Friday, December 5th, visibility in parts of central London had dropped to less than a foot. People reported not being able to see their own hands in front of their faces. Drivers abandoned their cars in the middle of streets. Bus conductors walked in front of their vehicles, holding torches, trying to find the road. The River Thames, one of the busiest waterways in the world, fell completely silent. No boats moved, no one dared. But life, as it does, tried to carry on. Children went to school, workers filed into offices. The BBC broadcast its morning programs. The newspapers ran their usual stories. And most people, standing at their windows staring into that thick, yellow-gray wall of nothing, did what Londoners tend to do in bad weather. They shrugged, pulled on their scarves, and stepped outside. They walked into poison. The smog that had settled over London was not simply dirty air. Scientists would later determine that each cubic meter contained catastrophic levels of sulfur dioxide, smoke particles, and acid compounds. The sulfuric acid alone was enough to strip paint from cars and corrode the stonework of buildings. What it was doing to human lungs was far worse. The particles were so fine, so microscopic, that no scarf, no handkerchief, no mask could stop them. They passed straight through and lodged deep in the bronchial tissue, causing immediate and severe inflammation. For healthy young people, it meant burning eyes, a raw throat, a persistent cough, unpleasant but survivable. For the elderly, for children, for anyone already living with heart disease, bronchitis, or asthma, it was something else entirely. It was a sentence. The hospitals began to fill on the first night. Doctors working the Friday evening shift noticed a surge in respiratory emergencies. Patients arriving struggling to breathe, lips turning blue from lack of oxygen, faces twisted in panic. By Saturday morning, the wards were overwhelmed. Ambulances were called and couldn't find the hospitals. Nurses worked through the night with no relief. Oxygen supplies at several London hospitals ran critically low by Sunday, and still the smog didn't move. Outside, the city had transformed into something from a nightmare. The famous yellow-green color of the smog, produced by the sulfur compounds reacting with moisture, cast an eerie light on empty streets. Cinemas closed mid-screening because audiences inside could no longer see the screen. At Sadler's Wells Theatre, a performance of La Traviata was halted in the second act. The singers could see nothing beyond the first few rows. The audience, coughing and struggling, quietly went home. If any of those audience members found dark comedy in leaving a show about a woman dying of a lung disease because the air was unbreathable, they did not record it. Animals began to die. At the Smithfield Livestock Show, prize cattle collapsed in their stalls. Veterinarians who rushed to help found the animals had essentially suffocated, their lungs coated in a thick black residue. 12 cattle died within hours. The images were horrifying, but they carried a warning that should have shaken every official in Westminster. If it was doing this to cattle, what was it doing to people? Across the city, the answer was being written in silence. In the East End, where the smog was thickest and the housing oldest and the people poorest, families huddled around the very coal fires that were making everything worse. They had no other way to keep warm. Elderly men and women who had survived 2 world wars sat in their armchairs and quietly stopped breathing. Some were not found for days. In some streets, neighbors didn't realize anything was wrong until the milkman noticed the bottles hadn't been taken in. The government, to its lasting shame, was slow to respond. Officials initially downplayed the event. The Minister of Health, Ian MacLeod, told Parliament there was no reason for undue concern. The official attitude was that London fogs were nothing new, that the British people were resilient, and that the weather would break soon enough. The word smog was carefully avoided in government statements. It suggested industry. It suggested blame. It suggested policy failure. It suggested, above all, a reckoning that no one in power wanted to have. Because the truth that would slowly, painfully emerge over the following weeks and months, was that this disaster had not come from nowhere. It had been built. It had been built over 100 years of industrial expansion, of burning cheap coal because it was profitable, of allowing factories to operate without adequate emission controls, of ignoring decades of scientific warnings about air pollution in British cities. As early as 1905, the word smog had been coined by a physician named Harold Antoine de Vaux, specifically to describe London's increasingly toxic mix of smoke and fog. A committee had been formed. Reports had been written. Nothing had changed. In 1948, a smog event in Donora, Pennsylvania, had killed 20 people and sickened nearly half the town's population. Scientists around the world had issued urgent warnings. British officials had noted the findings. Nothing had changed. London had been warned, and London had not listened. The smog finally broke on Tuesday, December 9th, when a westerly wind swept in from the Atlantic and pushed the poisoned air out over the North Sea. People stepped outside and breathed something clean for the first time in 5 days. They looked at the pale winter sky as if seeing it for the first time. Children played in the streets. Newspaper columnists wrote cheerfully about the end of London's latest pea soper. They had no idea what had happened. The death toll was calculated slowly, grudgingly over the following months. The initial government estimate was 4,000 deaths. That alone should have been an international emergency. But independent researchers, examining burial records and comparing death rates to the same period in previous years, arrived at very different numbers. Later studies, using more sophisticated analysis, concluded the true death toll of the Great Smog was between 10,000 and 12,000 people. More people killed in 5 days in one city than died in the entire Great Fire of London in 1666. More deaths than any single event in Britain since the Second World War. And it killed not with drama, not with spectacle, not with the terrible theater of violence, but with patience, with invisibility, with the simple, relentless accumulation of poison in the air that people could not stop breathing. Even now, the grief is hard to fully comprehend, because these were not deaths that arrived with warning. Most of the people who died on those cold December nights had no idea they were in danger. They had not been evacuated. They had not been warned. No sirens had sounded. No officials had appeared on the radio to tell them to stay inside, to close their windows, to seek shelter. They had simply lived their ordinary lives, made their suppers, put their children to bed, and did not wake up. The political fallout, when it finally came, was slow but irreversible. The government stonewalled for months, attempting to minimize the figures and avoid responsibility. But the public knew. Scientists knew. Journalists who had stood in those streets, who had seen the hospitals and the cattle, and the abandoned cars and the eerie yellow silence, knew. The pressure built until it could no longer be contained. In 1956, 4 years after the smog, the British Parliament passed the Clean Air Act. It was a landmark piece of legislation, one of the first in the world to directly regulate air pollution. It created smoke-free zones in cities. It incentivized the switch from coal to cleaner fuels. It gave local authorities the power to enforce emission standards. It was also an acknowledgement of something that governments are rarely willing to say out loud, that they had failed, that the warnings had been there, that the deaths had been preventable, that the silence of those December nights had not been natural. It had been chosen, year after year, in boardrooms and parliamentary chambers, whenever profit and convenience were weighed against human life, and human life was found lighter. London did not forget the Great Smog quickly. For a generation of Londoners, it remained a sensory memory. The smell of sulfur, the sting of burning eyes, the sound of a city holding its breath. Old photographs from those days show streets so thick with smog that the images look like they have been incompletely developed, the world dissolving at the edges, buildings fading into a gray nothing. There is something deeply unsettling about those photographs, because they do not look like a disaster. They look like weather. They look like an inconvenience. They do not look like a mass grave, but that is the nature of silent killers. They do not announce themselves. They do not wear the face of catastrophe. They come dressed in the ordinary, in the familiar, in the things we have always accepted, because they have always been there. Coal smoke rising from a million chimneys was the backdrop of Victorian London. It was Christmas card imagery. It was, in the words of one official who chose not to be named, simply the smell of industry doing its job. Today, London's air has improved dramatically since 1952. The coal fires are gone. The Clean Air Act worked, but air pollution in cities around the world remains one of the leading causes of preventable death. The World Health Organization estimates that 9 out of 10 people on Earth currently breathe air that exceeds safe pollution limits. Every year, 7 million people die from causes directly linked to air pollution. That is more than HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. The smog is still there. We have just learned, as London did for so long, not to see it. In Abney Park Cemetery in North London, there are graves from December 1952, plain stone markers with plain names. A grandfather, a retired schoolteacher, an infant, a woman of 43 who had survived the bombing of her street in 1941 and died in her own bed 11 years later, breathing the December air. They did not die in war. They did not die in fire. They did not die in any way that the history books find easy to count or easy to mourn. They died because the air was poisoned, and because the people who could have changed that had decided again and again that the cost of change was too high. Remember their names. Remember those yellow, silent streets. Remember that the deadliest things in history have rarely made a sound. And the next time someone tells you that environmental warnings are exaggerated, that the scientists are alarmist, that the regulations are too expensive, that the problem is not really so serious, remember London. Remember December. Remember that 12,000 people died of weather that was never really weather at all. Remember that silence, in the end, is not peaceful. It is a warning.